My youngest child, my daughter, she said, "Daddy, I don't want to be a Muslim." And I said, "Why? Why don't you want to be a Muslim? What have we done to you?" And she said, "Muslims are always angry and they're always killing people." I don't want to be angry. I don't want to kill anybody. I'm only 7 years old. Imagine hearing that from your child. So I said, "Where are you getting these messages from? Why do you think that Muslims have to be angry and we have to kill people?"
Today's guest is Haras Rafiq, one of the world's leading experts on Islamist extremism and radicalization. For more than 2 decades, he has advised governments, lawmakers, and security agencies on the threat of terrorism and political Islam, helping shape policy at the highest levels. He is also a trustee of Muslims Against Anti-Semitism and a prominent voice in the fight against hatred, extremism, and anti-Semitism. Today, we'll discuss the ideology behind Hamas, the role of the Muslim Brotherhood, the explosion of anti-Semitism after October 7th, the influence of Qatar and Western universities, and whether the West is winning or losing the battle for its future. Haras, welcome to Stand Tall Israel.
Daniel, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You were planning to become a counter-extremism expert. Everything changed because of, I believe, something that your 7-year-old daughter said to you. If you can take us back to that conversation.
Absolutely. My background, Daniel, is that from my mother's side, we've been in the United Kingdom, or her family's been in the United Kingdom since 1901. My father came over in 53. I was born in 65. And when I grew up as a youngster, I grew up just like anybody else. There were very, very few people that looked like me where we lived. There was no such thing as faith-based identity politics. And so it was very easy for us, and we were able to integrate into the community without losing our sense of what our religious identity was. So at home, of course, I ate the Pakistani food, and Islam is the religion, the faith that my father brought to the country, like many immigrants of the time, where there was no dichotomy between being, for me, British and Muslim, and for him, Indian or Pakistani after partition, and Muslim, and then British. And outside the house, I was like anybody else. I was a punk rocker because that was the vogue at the time when I was younger. And I went to university, just like a lot of my friends, etc. at the time. Left, and at the university, it was very interesting because I flirted because Islamism, and I'm sure we'll touch on what Islamism is in a little while. Islamism really didn't exist in any vast numbers within the university that I went to. So I became more of not quite a communist, but not far off. I had a Mohican and I wanted to ban the bomb, etc. I was reading medicine, but decided to do something else. Left, and I went into the corporate world, and I sat on the board of a number of large entities. One of them at the time in the 80s was in the 90s was a $19 billion company around the world. And then, as you rightly said, I came on one day, it was around about 2003, and my youngest child, my daughter, she said, "Daddy, I don't want to be a Muslim." And I said, "Why? Why don't you want to be a Muslim? What have we done to you?" And she said, "Muslims are always angry and they're always killing people." I don't want to be angry. I don't want to kill anybody. I'm only 7 years old. Imagine hearing that from your child. So I said, "Where are you getting these messages from? Why do you think that Muslims have to be angry and we have to kill people?" So she picks up the remote control and she flicks onto the television, and there was Sky News. It was just post 9/11. The Taliban were there. Al Qaeda were on the images and the videos of them burning effigies of Tony Blair and George Bush and firing rifles. This set off a chain process in my mind. Here was a young girl. She didn't know anything about Islam, really. She was 7 years old. She didn't know anything about geopolitics. She didn't know anything about life, innocence. Why is she thinking the way that she is? And if she's thinking the way that she is, what about other Muslim children? And just as importantly for me, what about my neighbors who are not Muslim? So this set off a weird period of my life when I traveled around the world, ended up in the Middle East, in the Swat Valley, in Pakistan, around the world, in Indonesia, just to explore what does it mean to be Muslim? Were my parents right? Is what's being portrayed now and the influence that the people, organizations like Taliban, etc., at the time Al-Qaeda have. Is that real Islam? What's going on? And it was the process of about a year, and I came back full circle almost to the same faith that my father brought, where it was a personal relationship that an individual has between themselves and God, the God of Abraham, and there is a focus on inner moral excellence, and it's a spiritual desire to get closer to God. But something was going on. There were people around the world that were Muslims that had been up to no good, as it were. So I left what I was doing and I ended up setting up an NGO. I also had to set up a couple of media companies just to keep paying the bills. And as you rightly said, I ended up on Tony Blair's task force post 7/7. I ended up on David Cameron's. I've worked with numerous prime ministers, secretaries of state, as you said. I'm currently working with ISCAP, the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism Policy. I'm the vice president of policy there. And for the last 21 years now, nearly, I've been focused on extremism, Islamism, advising, putting in strategies, trying to differentiate between Islam and Islamism, and also really try to do what I can and play my role in defending our liberal democracies.
Now, what did your travels around the world teach you about the gap between Islam as the religion it's supposed to be and what was being done in its name? If you can expound on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think it's very, very important to actually differentiate between Islam and Islamism. In the same way that there is a difference between social and socialism. Social happens to be the way that we interact with each other. It could be over a cup of coffee, it could be whatever. Socialism is a distinct political ideology that happens to be left of center. Islam is a religion, and it's practiced by so many, currently just under 1.9 billion, approximately 1.9 billion people around the world, in so many different ways. There are so many different sects. We talk about Sunni and Shia, but there are so many subsects. There are so many different interpretations and understandings of Islam. And often these people will actually excommunicate the other, and we get on, etc. But it is a spiritual relationship between the individual and God. And yes, there are do's and don't do's. Islamism is a distinct political ideology. And by the way, we haven't made up the name Islamism. It comes from the word Islamiyun, from the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, when they set up their charter to differentiate themselves from ordinary Muslims for Egypt at the time. So Islamism is a distinct political ideology, and it is a plausible reading of Islam, one of many. It wants two things, and the third thing is a tactic. The first thing that it wants to do is to set up this utopian Islamic state and enforce their version of law, state law, based on Sharia. By the way, there's no such thing as traditional classical Islam as Sharia law, as state law. When we talk about Sharia law in English, law is the noun and Sharia is the adjective describing the noun. In Arabic, Sharia is the noun, and it literally means the path to purification or the path to the oasis, and hence the path through purification to God. It has always been understood as a personal code. There is, however, something called fiqh jurisprudence, and there are so many schools of jurisprudence that pop up all the time. But Sharia as state law, apart from a period of time in Andalusia as a response to the Frankish, and apart from when ISIS tried to declare the Islamic State and some countries in the Middle East, recently has never been a concept of state law called Sharia law. So that's first of all. But these Islamists, they want to set up a utopian state and enforce, and I'm choosing my words very carefully, enforce a version of law, a state law, based on their interpretation of Sharia, the personal code, or fiqh jurisprudence, on the whole of its citizens. The second thing they want to do is to spread that around the world. And you can imagine nation states are not going to just sit back and let groups like ISIL or ISIS come along and say, hey, come and take over and plant your flag. That's going to involve fighting and war. The third thing that I mentioned was the tactic. And one of the main tactics that they use is what we've been calling the opium of the masses, and that is the destruction of Israel as a nation state within the Middle East. It's something that the left, well, Islamists, and I'm sure we'll talk about the regressive left and now the far right, can actually come together on. So I learned that there is a difference between Islam and Islamism. I learned that what my father taught me was actually traditional classical Islam. I met and studied under one of the greatest and most highly regarded sheikhs of his time, Sheikh Nazim al-Haqqani, and then Sheikh Hisham Qabani, who both since passed away, and learned about the pure spiritual essence of what it means to be a Muslim under this religion that we call Islam now. And that's what the majority of people want. And just talking about the word Islam and Muslim is very interesting as well. When I was 15, I was fortunate enough that my class at school, we did our maths GCSEs, which was O levels at the time, and English a year early because they thought we were bright. It happened to be that we were bright and we did get really good grades on our maths and English. So that when we were 15 to 16, we actually studied English literature, and Shakespeare was, for obvious reasons, Shakespeare was a core part of that syllabus that we studied. And I thought, as a 15-year-old who's just got the highest grade in the GCSE English language, I'm going to be able to pick up we happen to be reading The Merchant of Venice, and I'd be able to pick up The Merchant of Venice. I will understand it, and I'll be great at it. Well, I picked it up. I couldn't understand because the English that it was written in was a few hundred years old and nobody spoke the English because the context, the words, the way the language is created, I didn't have a clue. And so when I remember going to W.A. Smith's at the time and buying some books, and one act in particular, there were 3 different interpretations. Similarly, when we look at the word Islam, and even we will look at the Quran, Islam had a meaning, the word Islam 1400 years ago, and it has a different interpretation, translation, whatever you want to call it, of the same word. 1400 years ago, Islam, well, there are many translations, interpretations. The one that I liked, again, what my father taught me, what was generally what a lot of people of my sort of age group at the time thought, that the word Islam means to surrender to one deity and attain inner peace and spread outer peace, which is why when we greet each other, we say, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, or Shalom alaikum in the Jewish traditions. The whole concept is to attain inner peace through closeness to God, inner moral excellence, the purification of the self, and to spread outer peace. Because the inward and the outer, the first thing we do in the outer is wish somebody peace. And the word Muslim or Muslimin is anybody who is trying to submit to one deity, and in this case, the God of Abraham, and before, because there were books before. We can't be so arrogant that God didn't. The first time God revealed himself was during Abraham's, peace be upon his time. There were people before that as well. David, the Psalms of David, and the Zabur in Arabic. Anybody who's trying to do that or submits and tries to do that is a Muslim or a Muslimin. So that's a very important thing I think to consider. And I relearned that when my travels around the world under the studies of these 2 great shaykh, may God be pleased with them, taught me. But it was just full circle of what my father had actually taught me and my brothers and everybody else previously. But, as we grow up, we tend to rebel and forget, etc. You only remember after your parents pass away.
Now, you spent more than 20 years fighting extremism. Are we winning or losing? What concerns you more today than it did 20 years ago?
Oh, Daniel, how long have we got? I think we've only got an hour. I shall try to break this up into bite-sized chunks, if I may. 20 years ago, when I first started doing this, we're sort of in. Let's take the United Kingdom for a start. The United Kingdom was just kind of coming through the terrorism from Northern Ireland, but it was almost terrorism, but with rules, if you like. So when the IRA were going to set off a bomb, which they did in Manchester and other places in London, there would be a phone call and somebody would, to the police or something, there were certain coded messages, and a chance was given to evacuate people to limit deaths. So we kind of just come out of that. Al-Qaeda had become the threat of the time. and was the threat at the time. Al-Qaeda was an institution that we, the West, the people that led Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden and others, we'd kind of encouraged them to become the Mujahideen in the war against the Soviets. And then they decided that they just wanted to set up an Islamic State, and it was much more to them. We helped to export the ideology of Salafi jihadism into the Pakistan region, Swat, and people coming in from the Middle East, etc. So the relationship with Islamism goes way back. Even before that, if you look at, there have been many instances the last century where British intelligence, American intelligence, and others have, for their own purposes, and I fully understand that every country, nation say, I'm British and I want my country to do the best for our interests. So there have been instances of working in and out of Islamists, and you've got the Muslim Brotherhood Islamist originating from Egypt, and the Jamaat Islami from India at the time. But when I got into this, Al-Qaeda was the terrorist threat, and within our civil society, we had the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat Islami inspired institutional entrenchment. And tamkeen is the word that they use. And ISCAP has just done a report in November, which is probably one of the best analysis through source documents, explaining nearly halfway through his 100-year plan how the Muslim Brotherhood in particular are doing against this strategy that they put together of tamkeen. So we were facing an outward threat, direct threat from Al-Qaeda and other groups. And within our civil society, there was this propagation through entrenchment, through funding from the Middle East, and let's be honest, through nearly all of the countries at the time, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, they were all funding Islamism through the Muslim Brotherhood in the Western countries. So that's kind of what we were facing. Entryism and the radicalization was not as effective, had not been as effective as it is now, the entrenchment. And I'll give you an example of what I mean with that. And I'm going to use something. So I spent a number of years as an advisor at Europol. Europol is the EU equivalent to the FBI and to the counterterrorism department. And it was all sort of during ISIS time. And so one of the people there, Gilles de Kakov, and I was on a panel in Prague. He said this, therefore I can repeat it because it wasn't Chatham House. And this was sort of research that we'd done, and he was talking about it. If we take the attitude of Muslims at any given time, I'm going to use X, Y, and Z. X% because it varies from nation states. X% of Muslims directly support terrorist groups. Used to be Al-Qaeda, then it came ISIL, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, Hamas, and others, etc. Then you have Y% that actually sympathize. And what that means is they have the same objectives, Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaat Islami, Hizb ut-Tahrir, many, many others. I could go on and name so many of them. The same objectives, but they don't believe in violence right now. That's not their tactic. And then you have Y%, which are people who don't support. They don't have the same objectives, but they kind of understand why somebody might want to go and shoot up people in Charlie Hebdo, or they might want to justify October the 7th based on their perception of what the politics and of the region are. Gilles de Kakov said that the fastest time that he has witnessed through evidence of somebody going from empathy through sympathy to becoming operational is 2 weeks. There's a guy called Ziamani in the United Kingdom who had a bag with a machete, etc., and he was on his way to kill an off-duty British armed officer. Luckily, he was caught, but 3.5 months before he was caught, he wasn't even Muslim, he was Christian. So these are the challenges that we're facing. You asked me, how are we doing against that? One of the things so in the area of material support, there's been some good efforts, shall we say, across the world. In the United States, in Canada, in the UK, you hear about foil plots all the time. Sometimes they get through, and people do commit terrorist acts, and of course they do. But I can tell you that by far a huge factor, there are a huge factor percentage times X of plots that have been foiled thank God I'll say once again, they're the ones that have actually been committed in the West. And this initially was coming from Islamism inspired terrorism. So when I first got into it, through this entryism, through the fact that we in the West have failed now to define what it means to be British, to be American, to be Canadian. This has been sort of, I guess, fuel has been poured on the fire through the medium of social media. By the way, nobody goes online on social media and whoops, all of a sudden they're a jihadist or they've gone to buy something. Somebody has to find them, somebody has to recruit them, and they need to be pulled in a certain direction. But what's happened is that the threat we now face, still by far, is in the West, is from Islamist-inspired Salafi jihadism or a terrorism, or Hamas aren't quite Salafi in their theology, but they're still Islamist from the Muslim Brotherhood. The triple threat that we're facing is from the Islamist and theocracies, and also from the regressive left, because we talk about, people have talked about the Red-Green Alliance, and I'm happy to touch on that a little bit more. But more so recently, from the hard right as well, the old school fascists, the people that are on air and all of a sudden from the right are now picking up the rhetoric of Islamism. It's almost like the horseshoe theory. We're in a situation in the world which is, we're living the back end of the Weimar Republic again, if I'm honest. And the thing that binds them together, the thing that they can unify on, is their hatred of Jews, of the Jewish people, and the delegitimization and the destruction of Israel. So what we're facing now is what we're calling Islamism beyond Islamists and Islam. The threat is still there. There's still the old school threat. The rate at which people are being radicalized, there have been certain, October the 7th was one. I mean, when Hamas and other jihadist organizations from the Gaza region did what they did, I'm sure they didn't expect in their wildest dream that they would be able to unite these people, Muslims who are not Islamists, who actually hate the ideology of Islamism, who actually hate the theology of Salafism and Wahhabism, which underpins Salafi jihadism, emotionally radicalized to work with them. People from the left, people from the right as well. And the real threat we're facing now is this Islamism beyond Islamists and Islam. That's kind of where we are, and there's a whole bunch of strategies and things that we need to do. And I see that there are certain countries around the world that, we're facing a global insurgency. That's the point. And any global insurgency or any form of activity such need opportunity, motive, and they need money. I talked about the Middle Eastern countries in the past and how they were funding Islamism. The United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, to almost, I would say almost completely, have decided post the Arab Spring for their own reasons that Islamism, the Muslim Brotherhood especially, is a threat to them. So they've outlawed it and they've stopped funding many, if not all, of these initiatives around the world. But there's one country that's still doing it, and that's Qatar. If we could take Qatar out of the equation, if we could get them to change the way that they operate and the funding, etc., then it's a different ballgame. So this global insurgency around the world, and by the way, it suits their personal, political, geopolitical aims and objectives and needs, and they're super smart. And this entrenchment, this tamkeen, they have 4 pillars by which they operate. There is the political, i.e., change legislation, impact policies and laws. There's the controlling of the narrative. Sorry, the political is the policies and legislation. The controlling the narrative, frame the narrative. And I can talk about Islamophobia and why that term is not fit for purpose as well, if you like. From an intellectual perspective, they try to take control of lawfare, using the law. And then there's the institutional infiltration. And if you can get to the minds of smart, intelligent young adults at universities, you've got people who can help shape the future. And a lot of the work that we've been doing at ISCAP, amongst all of the areas, has been recently on the universities, money, influence, change of a direction that is being directed by a nation state that is still rogue by the definition of comparing it with the other countries in the Gulf for their own political agenda. And Islamism and the Muslim Brotherhood and Wahhabism is entrenched within their system. That was a long answer. That was a long sort of answer. My apologies. We went kind of quite in a lot of places.
That's
Is there?
perfect.
I mentioned Islamophobia. I think it's really interesting. You probably read articles or seen people that say that the Islamists are using the term Islamophobia to reject and deflect from legitimate criticisms of their ideology. But let me give you another argument. Again, I'm going to hearken about liberal democracies, and I talked about my sort of, I don't know anything else in terms of where to live. I don't want to live anywhere else. And to me, it's fragile, very fragile, because they're using our mechanisms of the freedoms that we have within our liberal democracies against them. It's the tolerance of the intolerant, as Popper said. They're using our tolerance to actually make us tolerate what is actually intolerant. There's been some scholars, I think it was Lovenstein, who talks about militant democracy, but that's not the point I was making. I live in a liberal democracy, and in a liberal democracy, no set of ideas, no set of values should be beyond critique, satire, or parody, whatever you want, including the values that I believe in. And Islam is a religion. It's not an ethnicity. It's a set of ideas, a set of values. I happen to ascribe and believe in a certain interpretation of them. In that liberal secular democracy, as I said, no set of ideas or values should be beyond these critique, satire, parody, even my own ideas and values, and I'll defend the right of people to have those views, but no individual should be beneath dignity. It's when that then lends into discrimination and bigotry against people, in this instance, who are Muslim, but generally because of their religion, their faith, their gender, etc., there are laws already in place that can be and should be applied fairly across the board. So that's kind of where we are in terms of Islamophobia, but I can't remember where it was that we were what led us here.
No, that actually leads me into my next question. Can we in the West fight Islamism, political Islam, while defending ordinary, peaceful Muslims at the same time?
I think we have to. I think it's very important because we can talk about suggestions and things that have been tried and things that have not worked. But if we don't do that, we're actually destroying our own liberal democracies. We're actually bound to fascism. There was a barbaric, horrific attempted murder. I can't call it anything else other than that, by somebody who happened to be a Sudanese migrant in Northern Ireland, which was caught on video, that did the rounds, I think, a couple of nights ago, or 2 or 3 nights ago. And that has led to fascists, ordinary people who might just be looking for a fight, a combination of people. And I'm saying this because there have been known fascist organizations that have Anders Breivik as their hero, who have called for these marches, as well as normal people as well. And ordinary. I'm not going to say every single person that's been on these marches is far right or fascist. But what that's led to yesterday, I don't know if you saw on the news, led to people saying the Lord's Prayer and then going out and petrol bombing houses. On some occasions, there were migrants, people, brown people, black people, and often other people who are not as well, indiscriminately, just going on the rampage. If we are not able to protect our liberal democracy, the extremists, whether they're from the regressive left, whether they're from the far right or the hard right, or whether they're Islamist, will win. So first of all, it's so important. It's these very values that allow me and anybody else to be whoever they want, to hold whatever views they want, providing they're not harming anybody or imposing them on somebody else or breaking the law. So first of all, it's so important that we do. If we don't, we've lost. If we can't navigate our way through, we've actually lost. And that's where I talk about the post-Weimar Republic. The end days of the Weimar Republic that we're living in, because it's so dangerous at the moment. It's when the Hitler took advantages of the fact that German people at the time, they'd lost a world war and they were paying for it as spoils of war, etc. The economy has crashed and people were desperate, etc., etc. So what did he do? He latched onto the far right ideology and the political views at the time. He went to Italy and picks up the far left, the regressive left views from Mussolini, packaged it all together, this horseshoe, and called his movement the National Socialist. But what did he do? He picked on and worked on the fears that people had. He blamed the Jews. And the old thing about, the old saying, Ali Wiesel said, the late Ali Wiesel said, what starts with the Jews does not end with the Jews. It went on to other things. Then it was other people, and then it was conquer Poland, and then it was an expansionist around the world. And thank God for Churchill in that time frame of his life. I'm not talking about anything else he may or may not have done before or after, who put up the fight. Otherwise, my mother's side would be speaking German and living a fascist, autocratic, totalitarian life, but governed by a fascist, autocratic, totalitarian state. It's so important. How do we do it? How do we do it? And I talked a minute ago about recognizing we also need to understand the processes of radicalization and how these are happening. I'm going to use Islamism as an example, but the processes, the pathways are not too dissimilar if you go to any ideology. And by the way, Islamists have not reinvented the wheel. They've learned from the fascists. They've learned from the communists. It's somebody who understands. And by the way, the ideologue, the main ideologue, the second, at Hassan al-Banna, and then we had Sayyid Qutb, and then Qaradawi and now Salabi. But Sayyid Qutb, when he wrote Milestones, which I guess was the equivalent of Das Kapital, he flirted with Marxism heavily. And I believe, this is my analysis, I believe the only reason he didn't become a fully blown Marxist, a communist, was because he still believed in God. So they'd learned. Islamism has learned from communism and Marxism. They're using the shield of the term Islamophobia. They're using institutional entrenchment. They've used money from other Middle Eastern countries in the past, and now Qatar. And of course, in Turkey, there's a lot going on as well, in Singapore and other places as well. The pathways that we find, and this is through de-radicalization of former jihadists, of former extremists. Through my old life, I was CEO of the world's first counter-extremism think tank for about 7.5 years, Quilliam Foundation or Quilliam International, operating in about 4 different countries. There is a beginning, middle, and an end point. The middle is the lens, the Islamism in this case. The start point is a grievance, and it starts with a grievance, and every single person in the world at any given time has a grievance. When I go to sleep tonight, I close my eyes, I'm going to have a grievance. I'm going to think about something that's troubling me, and it's going to be so important to me. But my grievance is not the same as yours, that you'll have, or somebody else in Africa who can't find water and food. But it's going to be important to me. So if we just focus on the grievances, we're just playing whack-a-mole. But grievances typically fall into 3 main categories. Actual grievances, it could be racism or something else. The leader of the 7/7 bombers in London, the grievance that led him down this pathway that I'm going to talk about was that he fell in love and his father wouldn't let him marry the girl at university. Islamists provided him with a solution, therefore he had hope. And that grievance is a genuine grievance. And there are on-ramps and off-ramps. The second category is partial grievances. There are things that I, as a British citizen, don't agree and haven't agreed with certain aspects of our foreign policy. It could be anything. But my question to people who would radicalize is, what has British foreign policy had to do with more than 1,000 people, maybe 2,000 people, we don't actually know the exact number, of people, Muslims, or thousands of people from the West, Muslims flying to Iraq and Syria to go and join ISIS and kill other Muslims? There is a partial truth, and they'll use this to recruit, and then there are perceived grievances, things that aren't really a grievance. An anecdote that I can relate is there was a former colleague of mine. He used to be a senior member of a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir, who was going for a caliphate last year. I think it was last year or the year before. They were prescribed in the United Kingdom. He was on a train and he saw this young mother. She was wearing the hijab, therefore she should be a Muslim. A young child. She was reading a newspaper The front page was a celebrity who'd just been found guilty of paedophilia. He realized in his mind that at that moment, this woman will probably have a protective cage around their young child, and he started a conversation about how the West is so morally corrupt. So look at all these people that these role models, etc., eventually got her through to the point where the only way that she could find protection for her young child as a young mother was to join the caliphate movement and to create the global Muslim ummah with a caliph. Genuine, partial, and perceived. In the middle, there's a lens. And in the lens, there are 5 macro movements. ISIS, Al-Qaeda, they don't radicalize anybody. What they do is take what groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat Islami do in the first 5 macro points, groupthink conditions I'm going to talk about, which are legal in a liberal democracy, and then tip some of them over the edge to go to 6 and 7. The first one is that you belong to a group, this gang. The second thing is that only people in this group are part of the gang. Everybody else, even other Muslims, are not part of it. The third one is that the gang, the group, is being what's the word I'm looking for? It's being attacked. It's being attacked. And the fourth part of the group think is everybody who's outside of the group is complicit in that attack. And number 5 is the supremacism narrative. All of this is legal. ISIS come along, Al Qaeda comes along, and tips some of them over the edge. Number 6, violence is justified. Self-defense is justified and violence is the only way. This is the lens, and the whole radicalization process looks at this grievance, this lens, and the output is what we see on the streets, what we see in terrorist attacks, what we see on recruiting online, what we see in anti-Semitism, what we see is a whole bunch of different things. You have to take, through this process, grievance, ideology, charismatic recruiters, and change the identity that this individual has to get him to move this way. Okay, if we understand that, I'm sorry I took so long to explain that, but if we understand that, then as a civil society, we can start coming up with solutions. The same works for the far left, the same works for the far right. It's similar processes, just different terminologies. We can start to put in from government, universities, people activists and social media, from grassroots movements, from parents, from schools, etc. We can start putting in strategies and tactics to diagnose, to expose, to disrupt, and to combat the ideology. Because if we just focus on the sharp end of terrorism, all we're doing is containing the problem. And you asked me what's different from 20 years ago. We haven't done enough work in the 5 areas that I mentioned, the groupthink, which is the building of resilience within the community so that when these ideologies are forced onto them, they have the resilience to push back. 20, 30, 40 years ago, there was more resilience. So we start putting things in there. The starting point has to be, from a civil society perspective, look at Islamism as a political ideology and treat it the same way that we would treat fascism, communism, racism, or any other thing that is against our liberal democracy, and hold the values consistent. If we're fighting that ideology, we're not going after Muslims per se. It's the ones that believe in it because we can expose them. That's number 1. Number 2, governments need to implement laws. The US recently has, through an executive order and then through State Department and OFAC, Treasury Department, have designated the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist entity in 3 countries. Foreign terrorist organization, FTO, in 3 countries. Egypt, Jordan, and the Lebanon. That's the first step from a Western country to recognize that the Muslim Brotherhood ideology actually plays a part and leads up to terrorism. But now what we've got to do is to take it to the United States or the United Kingdom. Well, the United Kingdom hasn't even done it, but I'm going to use the US. I'm going to switch from UK to US now. The next phase of that is because the Muslim Brotherhood does not exist as an entity in the United States or anywhere in Western countries. It doesn't exist. There is no Muslim Brotherhood LLC or whatever to actually prescribe. It didn't exist in these 3 countries and exists in other countries as well. And my hope is that this will be expanded to other countries. And it's based upon the thresholds that the United States has to designate as an FTO. Individuals, entities, organizations, Muslim Brotherhood have been named. So what do you do with that? Well, I talked about this entrenchment strategy at Tamkeen. The project was a 100-year plan. The exploratory memorandum was how to do it in North America. And you should read our report from November, Strategic Entryism by the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. It's online. It explains it. There's a 25-page version and a 200 and something page version. Take your pick. What we now need to do from a governmental perspective is to recognize that these are proxies. We can't call them fronts. We can't even call them Muslim Brotherhood organizations, but they are proxies. And at the very least, they are Muslim Brotherhood aligned in Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, etc., where money, individuals, ideologies have come over and set up these groups and these organizations. So what do we do about them? We have to disrupt them. We have to look for links that they have to these entities and start doing something about them. Because banning an ideology in a liberal democracy is unheard of. I mean, the KKK, for example, was never banned in the United States. And look at what they did. They were literally stringing African Americans up, lynching from the trees. They were never banned. But what the authorities did was go after them for criminal behavior. That's something governments need to do. But the first step is recognizing the idea without the ideology, you don't have Hamas. Without the ideology, you don't have Al Qaeda, ISIS. You don't have the Boko Haram, all of these groups. So governments need to do that. We as civil society need to look for the things that bind us together and start in the same way again, the anti-apartheid movement. Islamism is a fascist. I have been classed by Islamists and many other people that are like me as an Islamophobe. The Southern Poverty Law Centre went after Majid Nawaz, our chairman at Quilliam at the time, and Quilliam, where I was CEO, and named us as anti-Muslim extremists or anti-Muslim bigots. We took them to court the day before. They gave us an apology. We settled for $3.3 million. It's news. Southern Poverty Law Centre. We've got to go after them in the same way that we would go after communism, fascism, racism, other forms of xenophobia, isms within our civil society. And the shared values need to be defined a bit more. What does it mean to be now, no longer now? What does it mean to be a citizen of a liberal democracy? That's the question now. And then we have our subgroups, United Kingdom, US, Canada, etc. What does it mean? What are our shared values? Build alliances. Muslims, non-Muslims, Jews, Christians, people of faith, people of no faith, and take this challenge on. I could talk for hours and hours and hours about this, but that's at a top level what I believe right now is so severe. Let's talk about universities. Very, very important. Let's talk about education per se. ISCAP, we did a report on Texas A&M about a year and a half, 2 years ago. And we found their contracts, and we found three things. Well, four things, actually. First, there was $1.9 billion approximately of undeclared money that had come in to Texas A&M from a Qatari proxy. Secondly, all of the research, the intellectual property, belonged to the funder, and Texas A&M was doing some pretty state-of-the-art stuff. The second point was that up to 10% of those research grants, we found them on Qatar Foundation's website, and we downloaded them very quickly. Just under 10%, I think approximately, about 5 to 10%, had potential dual use. Could be nuclear, could be cyber, could be whatever. Texas A&M, one of the universities that, the university that looks after the site where the atom bomb was developed, for example, the Manhattan Project. Percentage of this IP was dual use. The third thing, under this contract, they had access to all student union information. That's a huge thing in the United States for a foreign state proxy to have access to student information. So we released a report. They pushed back. We released another report. It went viral. Texas A&M did the right thing. They pulled out of Qatar in Education City in Doha. And we've had other results with the program at Brown University, the Choices program, where Qatar Foundation International was funding. Anti-Semitic, anti-Western, even against people, Muslims like myself, propaganda. It's propaganda, it wasn't education. And recently, we did a report a few weeks ago on the Qatar Foundation International, which is a US proxy. And through the data, we found many, many things. It's the last report on the website, the most recent one. lo and behold, I'm not going to say they did it because of us. I'm not saying that at all. But we called for an investigation. Other entities did as well. But we did quite a forensic analysis, and they've decided to wind down their US operations for the K to 12. Chip away, get defeat, win some battles. As civil society, use it. In fact, reverse engineer what they've done, the 4 key pillars. But for that, we need allies. We need to work together. We need to have a starting point. We need to recognize it's Islamism and not Islam. It's a regressive left and not center left. It's the hard right, far right, and not center right. This is the space where we can come together, the centrist ground, recognize what it is that we stand for and what it is we're tackling, start putting these things into place. Sorry, again, I've rattled on. I'm so sorry, Daniel.
Yeah. Okay, and we have a short time left. I want to speak to you about October 7th. Did October 7th confirm fears that you've been warning about for years? And why do you think that so many people were willing to justify or excuse Hamas? Maybe you can touch upon the Red-Green Alliance.
This entrenchment, this institutional entrenchment, I mentioned that Qatar was a Marxist. When the left hear, the further left you go, when you hear arguments, intellectual arguments or ideological arguments from the Islamists, because Qutb was they sound familiar. That's very important. I did a training course with some civil servants years ago, and I put down on the left-hand side 7 grievances. And I said, here's a marker, go and tick them. They ticked every single one. And the flip chart, Osama bin Laden's the grievances for global Salafi jihad, they were all there and more. So they're familiar. And civil services around the world, institutionally, are center-left. It is what it is. That's number one. Secondly, now I'm going to talk about the right as well, because we don't talk enough about the right. When Qutb and Salabi and all of these people talk about the Jews, and they talk about, it used to be that Jews are evil. Now they're framed as everything evil is Jewish. The old protocols of the elder, the Zion, the old tropes. So when October the 7th happened, this had been going on for decades unchecked. It wasn't a surprise to me, because the ground was laid and had been laid for decades in the universities, in the activist movements, within the institutional bureaucracy, on social media, on TV. The groundwork had been done for decades unchallenged because of fear of Islamophobia, because of fear of old ideas of colonialism from the past and how Britain and other countries have not behaved very well, etc. It didn't surprise me. But what's really also interesting is that if you look at the factors of radicalization, because that's what we're looking at really, it's the intellectual, it's the ideological, it's the social, it's the emotional and religious aspects of moving people to a particular viewpoint from an Islamist perspective, whether you're Muslim or not. And the biggest one in the world that we live in is the emotional. If the narrative can be created that this was XYZ and ABC are suffering and your governments are complicit, throw it in with all the other things, it's just radicalization on steroids. The movements were ready with their propaganda in some countries literally on the 7th. So and some on the 8th. Posters and marches, etc., which then, if you think about it logically, somebody must have known that something was coming, not when. It was a coordinated, well-planned attack from their perspective. The groundwork was laid, decades of unchallenged entrenchment. I'm not surprised. What I am surprised about is that still people can't see it, or some people can't see it. People who have been in movements before. I know people who've been communists before. I know people ex-neo-Nazis. They can't see it. And I think somewhere along the way, maybe there's the desire not to see it. And the final thing I'll say is, look, I'm British. I'm British as far as I don't know anywhere else. I don't have any nationalities. But even in my country, I remember as a youngster, institutional anti-Semitism never went away. It was always there. So maybe there was a desire to want to believe subconsciously somewhere all of the things that were being said about the Jewish people. I'm not surprised. But this alliance is strong. The red-green, it's been going on for decades. You look at a lot of the movements, the trade unions movements, and you'll see leading Islamists, who've not only entrenched themselves, but they've got leading positions. You look at the politicians in the United States. The mayor of New York, he founded the chapter of the SJP, which we've proven, the Students for Justice of Palestine, which we've proven in our report that the leadership with the American Muslims of Palestine, the leadership of the SJP, have direct links, as proven in a court of law in the United States through the Holy Land Foundation trial, to terrorists. And yet, many Jews in New York voted for him. They're able to deflect. They're able to use this emotional, because I'm sure people in New York, ordinary people, care about their pocket and how can they pay the bills, etc., etc. And that's the emotion that they're tugging on. But Islamists have done, in terms of policy, but Islamists have really, really, for decades, pulled the emotional heartstrings. And my worry now is that the pushback, the things that we need to do, including getting Qatar to stop doing what they're doing in the same way Saudi Arabia and others have done, I hope we're able to do it before it's too late.
We're speaking right now during a period of direct confrontation between Israel and Iran. What should people understand about the Islamic Republic of Iran's role in the wider Islamist movement and terrorism worldwide?
Iranian regime is a Shia Islamist movement. They believe in something called the Guardian of the Scholars, and what they did was they took the Islamist merger of church and state, and for the first time in Shia traditions, they brought it. There are people in Sistani is in Iraq who's the Ayatollah. I take no view on whether he's a good guy or bad guy, but he certainly doesn't believe in Islamism and the integration of church and state. So they are Shia Islamists from that perspective. Them working with Hamas and working with other entities in the region is just tactical. At the end of the day, part of their core creed is that they are paving the way for the Messiah, for the Mahdi, and they want control of Mecca and Medina. That's what they really want. In their theology, they don't even regard Jerusalem, the Temple Mount or the Beit al-Maqdis, as actually a holy place. But it's mainstream Sunni that believe in the night journey. Traditional Shia theology believes that the night journey happened somewhere else, not Jerusalem. So it's not even that important for them from a theological perspective, but tactically, it's vital, this opium of the masses. And for decades, for numbers of decades, since the creation of Israel this time around and the wars, etc., this is what bring people together. Pan-Arabism at one time, but they are a Shia Islamist organization that they claim are paving the way for the Mahdi, and they are a threat to not only Israel, but a threat to every single country in the region, because they, in their creed, believe that these are the rulers of the countries and the people who believe in that are not even Muslim, and they actually are the enemies, and it's tactical. So they're a threat to every single country in the Middle East. Now, the asymmetric war side of that is they're a threat to everywhere else in the West, because they are a major part of this global insurgency. And I'm sure, well, we know because there have been foiled terrorist plots and lots of arrests in the United Kingdom and Australia and other places as well. They're a threat to us in the West as well, but for different reasons.
Haras, I want to thank you for your time, for this eye-opening conversation. Where can people find you? Where can they read, your articles and things like that?
So they can find me on from the ISCAP email, info@iscap.org. I'm contactable there. That's absolutely fine. And what we write, we have a policy at ISCAP that every single research project that we work on, it's actually a team. And so we don't actually put names against people, authors, etc. So they're all collaborative. But our works you can find on ISCAP's website, on the Follow the Money, the more recent work over the last 3 years on ISCAP's Follow the Money section within the website.
Thank you again.
My pleasure, Daniel. Thank you for having me.